I remember the exact sound of the spoon hitting the ceramic bowl. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just a soft, hollow clink that echoed in the quiet kitchen like a small announcement that something inside me had finally broken. I was standing at the counter, my hands trembling so badly that I had to brace my wrist against the edge just to keep from spilling the soup. The steam rose in thin, ghost-like ribbons and fogged my glasses. For a moment I couldn't see anything clearly, not the pale broth, not the tiny orange squares of carrot floating on top, not even my own reflection in the microwave door across from me. My chest felt tight. Every breath scraped my throat like sandpaper. The doctor had used a gentle voice that morning, the kind professionals use when they're trying not to scare you. You need rest, he'd said. Real rest. And someone should stay with you. Someone should stay with you. The sentence replayed in my mind like a stubborn echo as I shuffled toward the dining table. My slippers dragged against the tile. Each step sent a dull ache up my spine. I lowered myself into the chair slowly, carefully, like an old building settling into its foundation. The house was silent, not the peaceful silence I used to treasure when the children were young and finally asleep. This silence was different. It was wide and empty, stretching from room to room like an abandoned hallway. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second landing with an accusing precision. I glanced at my phone lying face up beside my bowl. No new messages. I had sent 3 texts that morning. The first was simple. Doctor says I'm pretty sick. Could use some help today. The second came 2 hours later. Is anyone free to come by? I'm feeling worse. The third was shorter, smaller. Hello? The screen stayed stubbornly blank. I told myself they were busy. They all had important lives, careers, meetings, school runs. The world didn't stop spinning just because I felt like my body was quietly collapsing from the inside out. Still, a small voice inside me whispered a question I didn't want to hear. If I were important enough, wouldn't someone have answered by now? I lifted the spoon to my lips. The soup tasted like nothing. My tongue felt numb. Even swallowing was an effort. A wave of dizziness rolled over me, and I closed my eyes, gripping the edge of the table until it passed. That was when I heard the front door open. The sound was sudden and sharp, slicing through the silence. Relief flooded my chest so quickly it almost hurt. My shoulders sagged. A shaky breath escaped me. Someone came. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Quick, purposeful. I tried to stand, but my legs protested. So I remained seated, turning my head toward the doorway. My daughter, Melissa, appeared first. Her hair was pulled into a sleek ponytail, her coat still buttoned. She looked like she was passing through an airport rather than entering her mother's home. Behind her, my son Daniel scrolled through his phone, barely glancing up as he stepped inside. For a moment, they didn't see me. They were talking in low, hurried voices. I told you we don't have time for this, Daniel muttered. Melissa sighed. We'll just check on her and go. It'll take 10 minutes. 10 minutes. The words landed heavily in my stomach. I cleared my throat. The sound came out weaker than I intended. I'm in here, I called. They both turned. Surprise flickered across Melissa's face, quickly replaced by a tight smile. Mom? She said brightly, stepping into the kitchen. You look okay. Okay. I almost laughed. My skin felt too tight for my bones. My head throbbed with a steady pulse. But I nodded anyway. It was easier than explaining. Daniel hovered near the doorway, his eyes darting around the kitchen like he was cataloging a space he no longer recognized. You texted, he said. Not a question. A statement. Yes. I replied softly. I'm not feeling well. The doctor said I shouldn't be alone. Melissa exchanged a glance with her brother. It was quick, but I caught it. A silent conversation passed between them, efficient and practiced. Well, she began, slipping off her coat but keeping her purse slung over her shoulder. We wanted to come by, but today's really hectic. I have a presentation in an hour, and Daniel has to pick up the kids. I see, I said. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker. Daniel finally stepped inside. Did the doctor say what it is? An infection, I answered. And my heart. It's under a lot of strain. He said I need monitoring. Someone to stay with me for a few days. The words hung in the air. Melissa's smile faltered. A few days? Yes. Silence stretched between us. I could almost hear the ticking clock counting down their patience. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. Mom, we can't just rearrange everything on such short notice. I stared at him. This was the same boy who used to crawl into my bed after nightmares, clutching my arm like I was the only solid thing in his universe. I had rearranged entire worlds for him without hesitation. I understand you're busy, I said carefully, but I'm scared. I don't want to be alone. There it was. The truth, stripped bare and trembling. Melissa's expression softened for a fraction of a second, then hardened again. Maybe we can hire someone, she suggested quickly. A nurse. That would be more practical. Practical. The word felt clinical, distant. I don't need a stranger, I whispered. I need my children. The sentence seemed to make them uncomfortable. Daniel shifted his weight. Melissa checked her watch. Mom, Daniel said, his voice taking on that patient tone people use with the elderly. We have responsibilities. We can't just drop everything. I looked from one face to the other. They were so familiar and yet so impossibly far away. It was like staring at photographs of people I once knew. A strange calm settled over me. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was something colder, clearer. I nodded slowly. Of course, I said. I wouldn't want to inconvenience you. Relief washed over their features so visibly it was almost painful to witness. Melissa stepped forward and kissed my cheek, her lips barely brushing my skin. We'll call a service, she promised. They'll take good care of you. Daniel gave my shoulder a quick squeeze. Rest, okay? And just like that, they were gone. The front door closed with a soft click. I sat alone at the table, the untouched soup cooling in front of me. The house returned to its vast, echoing silence. But something inside that silence had changed. I felt it settle deep in my chest, solid and immovable, for the first time since the doctor's appointment. My hands stopped shaking. I reached for my phone, not to check for messages, but to open a different screen. My reflection stared back at me from the dark glass, pale, tired, older than I remembered. They're busy, I murmured to the empty room. The words sounded foreign on my tongue. Busy. I repeated it once more, tasting it carefully, letting it sink in. Then I set the phone down and folded my hands in my lap. A quiet realization unfolded in my mind with the slow certainty of sunrise. If my absence would be an inconvenience to them, then perhaps it was time for them to understand what my presence had truly been worth. I didn't cry. The tears hovered somewhere distant, unreachable. Instead, a steady warmth spread through me, not comforting, but resolute. I picked up the spoon again and forced myself to swallow another mouthful of soup. It was still tasteless, still thin, but my thoughts were sharpening, and in the deep, silent chambers of my heart, a decision was beginning to take shape. A small one, a quiet one, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that it would change everything. The decision didn't arrive all at once. It wasn't a lightning strike or a sudden burst of anger. It was quieter than that. It settled into me over the next few days like dust slowly covering forgotten furniture. The nurse agency Melissa had called sent a young woman named Carla. She was kind in the way professionals are trained to be: gentle voice, efficient hands, a smile that never quite reached her eyes because it belonged to the job, not to me. She checked my temperature, arranged my pills in a neat plastic organizer, and moved through my house with respectful caution, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts of a life she didn't know. I watched her from the couch, wrapped in a blanket that still carried the faint scent of lavender detergent. The living room was filled with afternoon light. Dust particles floated lazily in the sunbeams, and I found myself tracking their slow dance just to pass the time. This is a beautiful home, Carla said as she adjusted the curtains. Thank you, I replied. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. My husband and I bought it 42 years ago. The words opened a small door in my memory, and suddenly I was standing in that same room decades earlier, the walls bare and the floors echoing with possibility. I could see Thomas laughing as he spun me in a circle, our footsteps loud on the hardwood. "It's ours," he had whispered, his forehead pressed against mine. Everything starts here. Everything had started there. Our children's first steps, birthday parties that spilled into the backyard, Christmas mornings when wrapping paper covered every surface like bright snow. The house had absorbed all of it, every joy, every argument, every quiet reconciliation. After Thomas passed, the house became my anchor. It held the shape of our family even as the children grew and drifted outward, pulled by their own lives. I told myself that was the natural order of things. Children were meant to leave. A mother's job was to prepare them for distance, but no one tells you how sharp that distance can feel when it finally settles in. Carla's phone buzzed softly in her pocket. She glanced at it, apologetic. "Sorry," she murmured, stepping into the hallway to answer. Her voice faded into a hushed murmur. I turned my gaze to the framed photographs lining the mantel. There was Melissa at 8 years old, missing her front teeth and grinning at the camera with unfiltered delight. Next to her stood Daniel at 10, his arms slung protectively around his sister's shoulders. I remembered that day vividly, a picnic by the lake, the air thick with the smell of sunscreen and fresh grass. They had been inseparable then, and I had been the center of their small universe. Every scraped knee and whispered fear brought them running to me. I was their constant, their safe place. When had that changed? The question wasn't bitter. It was curious, almost clinical. I traced a timeline in my mind. Melissa's first job in the city, Daniel's marriage, and the arrival of his children. Each milestone added a new layer to their identities, and with each layer, my role grew thinner. I told myself I was proud of their independence, and I was. But pride and loneliness are not opposites. They coexist in uncomfortable harmony. Carla returned a few minutes later, her expression apologetic. "My son's school," she explained. "Nothing serious." I nodded. Children have a way of reminding us where our priorities lie. She smiled warmly. They do. The simplicity of that exchange lingered with me after she resumed her tasks. Priorities. The word echoed in my thoughts. Had I slipped so far down my children's list of priorities that my illness registered as an inconvenience rather than a call for concern? I replayed our conversation in the kitchen, analyzing each pause and glance like a detective studying evidence. I didn't want to paint them as villains. They weren't cruel people. They were busy, successful, absorbed in the momentum of their own lives. I had raised them to be that way, to chase opportunities, to build something meaningful. Perhaps this was the unintended consequence of my success as a mother. That evening, Melissa called. Her name lit up my phone screen, and a small flutter stirred in my chest. I answered on the second ring. "Hi, Mom," she said briskly. I could hear traffic in the background, the distant honk of horns. "How are you feeling?" "Better," I replied. It wasn't entirely true, but it was easier than detailing my lingering weakness. "The nurse is very attentive." "Good," she said. Relief colored her tone. "I was worried about you being alone." I almost laughed at the irony, but I swallowed it. "I appreciate you arranging the help." "Of course. That's what family is for." The sentence hung in the air, polished and perfect. Family is for support, for care, for presence. Yet her voice felt miles away, filtered through layers of obligation. "Are you coming by this week?" I asked gently. There was a brief pause. Papers rustled on her end. "This week is tough," she admitted. "I have deadlines stacked on top of each other." "Maybe this weekend?" "Maybe," I echoed. We spoke for a few more minutes about trivial things, the weather, her latest project, a restaurant she wanted to try. The conversation skimmed the surface of our lives, never diving into the deeper waters where my fear and disappointment waited. When we hung up, the house felt even quieter than before. I realized then that my relationship with my children had become a series of polite exchanges, carefully curated to avoid discomfort. We spoke often, but rarely about anything that mattered. My struggles were softened, edited, presented in manageable fragments. In return, they offered updates about their achievements and plans, their voices bright with forward motion. Somewhere along the way, we had all agreed silently to keep the messy parts of our lives to ourselves. The days passed in a slow rhythm of medication and rest. Carla came and went. Daniel called once, his voice distracted as he recounted a chaotic morning with the kids. "You sound tired," I observed. He laughed. "That's parenthood." I pictured my grandchildren, their boundless energy, their sticky hands and unfiltered laughter. A pang of longing tugged at me. I hadn't seen them in weeks. "Bring them by sometime," I suggested. "Yeah," he said. "We should do that." We both knew it was a promise suspended in uncertainty. After the call ended, I sat by the window and watched the neighborhood unfold. A young mother pushed a stroller down the sidewalk, her face soft with concentration. An elderly couple walked hand in hand, their steps synchronized by years of companionship. I felt like an observer peering through glass at a world that continued without me. It wasn't just my illness that unsettled me. It was the realization that my place in my children's lives had shifted from essential to optional. I was a chapter they had already read, a foundation they rarely revisited, and yet I had built my entire existence around them. The imbalance was stark. For decades, my days revolved around their needs, their schedules, their emotions. I had poured myself into their growth with quiet devotion. Now, standing on the other side of that devotion, I found myself adrift. One afternoon, as I sorted through old documents at the dining table, insurance papers, bank statements, the practical skeleton of a life, I stumbled upon Thomas's will. My fingers traced his familiar signature, and a wave of tenderness washed over me. He had always been meticulous about our future. "Security," he used to say, tapping the stack of papers. "It's the greatest gift we can give them." We had planned carefully. Investments, savings, the house itself, everything structured to ensure that our children would inherit stability. I had taken comfort in that plan. It felt like a continuation of my role as their protector. But as I studied the documents with fresh eyes, a subtle unease stirred within me. The house, our house, was the centerpiece of that inheritance. Its value had grown over the years, quietly accumulating worth as the neighborhood flourished. To Melissa and Daniel, it was likely an abstract asset, a future windfall discussed in practical terms. To me, it was the repository of my entire adult life. I imagined a future conversation, years from now, where my children would stand in this very room discussing renovations or sale prices. The thought didn't anger me. It saddened me with a gentle, persistent ache. Was that all this space would become to them? A transaction? I folded the will carefully and returned it to its envelope. My hands were steady. My mind, however, was alive with a new clarity. For the first time, I considered the possibility that my life, my resources, my presence might hold value beyond their expectations. Not as a weapon or a bargaining chip, but as an expression of my own agency. I had spent so many years defining myself through my role as a mother that I had neglected the quieter truth. I was still an individual with choices. The realization was both liberating and unsettling. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in muted shades of gold, I sat alone in the living room and let the silence settle around me. It no longer felt empty. It felt full of potential, humming with unspoken questions. What did I want the rest of my life to look like? The answer didn't come immediately. It unfolded slowly, like a photograph developing in dim light. I saw glimpses of independence, of purpose not tethered solely to my children's orbit. I felt a stirring desire to reclaim parts of myself that had been quietly set aside, and beneath that desire lay a steady, unmistakable resolve. If my children saw me as peripheral, as someone whose needs could be delegated to strangers, then I would redefine the terms of our relationship. Not through confrontation or bitterness, but through action. A quiet move, I thought. The phrase surfaced unbidden, settling into my mind with surprising weight. It wasn't about punishment. It was about balance, about reminding myself and perhaps them that my life was not a background detail in their story. It was a story of its own. As darkness filled the room, I rose from the couch and walked slowly through the house. My footsteps echoed softly against the floors Thomas and I had chosen together. I touched the walls, the furniture, the familiar objects that had witnessed decades of love and labor. This was my domain, my history, my future. And somewhere within these walls, a plan was beginning to take shape, delicate and deliberate, guided not by anger but by a calm, unwavering sense of self. I returned to the dining table and sat down, my gaze resting on the envelope containing the will. The air felt charged with quiet significance. For the first time since my illness began, I didn't feel fragile. I felt awake. And in that awakening, I sensed the first stirrings of a transformation that would ripple through my family in ways they could not yet imagine. The first signs came in small, almost imperceptible ways. I noticed them before I fully realized what they meant. A glance that lingered too long on a clock, a sigh barely contained when I asked a question, a subtle hesitation before answering my calls. These weren't dramatic confrontations, they were quiet betrayals, the kind that slip past notice until they've already left a mark. It started with Daniel. One afternoon, as he helped me sit up in the living room chair, I mentioned a new symptom I'd noticed: a sudden fatigue, the brief spells of dizziness that left me grasping the armrest. He nodded slowly, eyes shifting to the window as if tracking something outside. "Mom, you're fine. It's probably just nothing," he said. His tone was dismissive, soft but cutting. There was no malice, only an unspoken expectation that I would simply endure, that my fears were inconvenient. I wanted to argue, to insist that I was not fine, that something was wrong. But I didn't. I nodded instead, pretending the ache in my chest was imagined, pretending I didn't notice the flicker of impatience in his gaze. Melissa was no different. When she called later that week, her voice bright and hurried, she asked about my health, but only in the cursory, checkbox sense. "How's your blood pressure? Did you take your meds?" she asked, her words clipped, each question like a line in a survey rather than a conversation. When I paused to explain the subtle changes I had felt, her responses were minimal, distracted. I could hear the faint hum of her laptop in the background and the hurried tapping of keys. "I'm sure it's nothing, Mom," she said finally. "Just keep an eye on it." And that was it. That was all. The concern was perfunctory, a gesture rather than a feeling. I remember sitting back in my chair after the call ended, phone still in my hand, staring at the muted screen. It felt heavier than I expected, as if it carried the weight of their indifference. I realized then that this wasn't just a matter of busyness. Their lives were full. Yes, but in that fullness, there was little space for me. Not truly. I began to notice patterns, small omissions that revealed more than words could. Birthdays went by with only a text message. Dinner invitations were routinely declined. When I mentioned a doctor's visit or a minor discomfort, it was met with sympathy expressed in hurried tones. Never lingering concern. Even Carla, the nurse, remarked on it one day as she adjusted my pillows. "They check in sometimes, right?" she asked, casual, almost shyly. I shook my head, though my throat tightened. "Sometimes," I admitted. The word tasted bitter on my tongue. But not enough. There was a particular afternoon when the disrespect became almost tangible. I had prepared a small tray of tea and biscuits, a simple gesture of care, hoping to entice them into spending a quiet moment together. Daniel arrived first, reluctantly, barely looking up as he settled into the chair across from me. "Tea's ready," I said softly, gesturing toward the tray. He glanced at it, then back at his phone. "Thanks," he muttered, but didn't reach for a cup. Melissa arrived shortly after, carrying a bag of papers she had forgotten at the office. She kissed my cheek politely, muttered something about a meeting she had to attend soon, and then, without pause, flipped open her laptop at the dining table. The tea sat untouched, cooling slowly. I watched them. Their presence was in the room. Yes, but it wasn't with me. Their bodies were there, but their attention was elsewhere, consumed by emails, schedules, and obligations that dwarfed the simple act of being together. The sense of invisibility, of being relegated to background noise, settled into me like a fog. It wasn't rage that stirred. Not yet. It was awareness. I realized I had spent my life giving them not just care but my full attention, my emotional labor, my quiet sacrifices. And in return, I received acknowledgement only when convenient, affection only when it could fit neatly into their schedules, One evening, after they had left, I walked slowly through the house. Each room held memories, photographs on the wall, toys tucked into corners, school projects displayed with pride, and yet, in every corner, I could sense my absence in the present. The past was crowded with my efforts, but the present was almost entirely theirs. I sat down in Thomas's old armchair, the one he had reserved for quiet reading, and let myself sink into reflection. The ache of neglect was subtle but insistent. I understood, finally, that the problem wasn't a single incident or a harsh word. It was the accumulation of indifference, the quiet erosion of my significance in their lives. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe in silence. And I began to think not about retaliation, not about anger, but about strategy, about how to reclaim a place of respect and presence without resorting to confrontation or noise, how to make them see me, not in flashes of guilt or obligation, but in undeniable, deliberate ways. It wasn't about punishment. It was about acknowledgement. I remembered Thomas's words from years ago. There's power in patience, in planning. Anger is temporary. Strategy lasts. And that night, under the soft glow of the bedside lamp, I began to plan. Small moves, quiet, unassuming actions that, when the time was right, would shift the balance without ever appearing forceful, because true presence, I realized, was not given freely to those who chose to ignore it. It had to be claimed, and I was ready to begin. The tension didn't announce itself with fireworks. It crept in, a low hum that grew louder each day. It started with small incidents, almost forgettable if you weren't paying attention: calls ignored, plans postponed, words left unsaid. But when they accumulate, the quiet slides become a roar in your mind. And I was listening carefully now. It began on a Wednesday morning. I had managed to get out of bed early, shivering from the fever that had settled into my bones. The house smelled faintly of Carla's cleaning supplies, and sunlight spilled in through the curtains, making dust particles float like tiny stars. I called Melissa to ask if she could pick up some prescriptions on her way back from work. Her response was clipped. I don't think I can. Mom, traffic's terrible. There was no offer to send someone else, no expression of concern, just an immediate, unyielding obstacle. I nodded silently to the phone, swallowing the frustration that burned my throat. Of course, I murmured, even though the words were unnecessary. They weren't listening anyway. Daniel's failures were subtler, more insidious. He would check in once a day, never for more than a few minutes, asking perfunctory questions as if reading from a script. Are you eating? Are you resting? But when I mentioned a new symptom like the dizziness that now seemed to arrive unbidden, he would wave it off. Probably just the meds, Mom. Don't worry about it. And yet I was worried, not just about my health, but about being seen, about being recognized as more than an inconvenience. The house, my sanctuary, began to feel like a stage where my presence was tolerated, but never honored. One afternoon, I decided to bake. It was something I hadn't done in years: pie crusts, flaky and soft, apples spiced just as Thomas had taught me. I wanted to fill the house with warmth, with the scent of home, with a memory that belonged to all of us. Melissa came by later, but only for a brief moment. She walked in, glanced at the pie, and said, "Looks nice," before pulling out her phone. She stood in the doorway, fingers scrolling, eyes glazed, nodding at Daniel, who had just called with some update about his kids. "Are you hungry?" I asked gently, trying to draw her into the kitchen, to participate, even in a small way, in the domestic ritual we had once shared. "I'm fine," she said quickly, lips tight. "I've got a meeting in 10. She glanced at her watch, and with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, she left, leaving the pie steaming on the counter. Daniel came the next day. He took one bite, muttered, "Good," and returned to his phone. He didn't ask how I was feeling beyond the generic. He didn't linger, didn't make conversation. He was physically present, but emotionally absent. The subtle neglect, the constant micro-disappointments, began to accumulate into something heavier. I could feel it settling in my chest, a leaden weight that didn't ease even as I forced myself to smile for Carla, for myself. I had spent decades nurturing their lives, protecting their emotions, building routines and traditions around their happiness. Now, in my time of need, they treated me as a secondary character in my own story. One evening, I overheard Melissa on a call in the living room. She was speaking quietly, but not so quietly that I couldn't hear the inflection of irritation. "I don't know, Daniel," she said. "It's just, Mom's always so dramatic about her health. I think she exaggerates." I froze, spoon in hand, the half-eaten soup cooling in the bowl. Dramatic? I wanted to cry, to scream, to tell her that a fever isn't drama, that dizziness isn't exaggeration, that fear is not theatricality. But I didn't. I put the spoon down, wiped my hand on the napkin, and walked slowly to the window. I watched the street outside, watching life continue without me, and let the quiet settle over me. Later that week, Daniel came to help me with some paperwork, insurance forms, doctor instructions, financial statements. He was efficient, fast, and distant. He sorted, ticked boxes, signed forms. He barely spoke, except to correct minor details or offer short, dismissive comments. I realized then that their care was transactional. Not malicious, not intentionally cruel, but transactional. They were willing to provide assistance only when it didn't inconvenience them. My illness, my discomfort, my presence, they were variables that must be managed, rather than a reality to be embraced. It was the combination of all these moments, the missed calls, the half-hearted visits, the comments whispered behind my back, that built the storm inside me. Each incident alone would have been bearable, but together, they painted a picture I could no longer ignore. My children had become indifferent to my suffering. That was the breaking point. I sat in the dining room one evening, alone, watching the golden light fade outside the window. I thought about the years I had given them, years of waking before sunrise to make sure breakfast was ready, years of sleepless nights during illnesses and heartbreaks, years of quiet sacrifice. And I understood, with crystal clarity, that all of that devotion had not guaranteed recognition or respect. Something inside me shifted. A calm, deliberate focus replaced the simmering frustration. I would not scream. I would not demand. I would not beg. That was not the way I operated. That had never been my way. Instead, I began to consider the possibilities. What could I do that was quiet, almost invisible, but utterly undeniable? How could I reclaim my dignity, my presence, my power, not through confrontation, but through action? I started making notes, small reminders to myself, observations of their patterns, their schedules, their weaknesses. It wasn't revenge yet, not the kind that breaks the world. It was preparation, strategy, observation, because I realized something essential. When people ignore the value of your presence, they are giving you a gift of leverage. And I intended to use it carefully. The storm had arrived, not in shouts or slamming doors, but in silence. And I had learned how to wield it. I walked to the window and watched a car pass by on the street, headlights glinting on wet asphalt. I felt the quiet power of a plan taking root, a subtle, unassailable energy flowing through me. The time for action would come, but for now, I watched, I waited, and I gathered my strength, and in that quiet, I understood that the imbalance had shifted. Though they did not know it yet, the scales were beginning to tip. The breaking point arrived on a morning that began like any other, but carried the weight of inevitability. I had woken before dawn, the kind of quiet hour when the world feels suspended, where even the usual hum of the neighborhood seemed paused in anticipation. My body still ached, weakness clinging to my bones like a second skin, but my mind was sharper than it had been in weeks. Daniel and Melissa arrived together that day. Rarely did they synchronize schedules, and I felt the air shift as soon as they stepped through the doorway. They were polite, almost formally so, moving through the house with the practiced ease of people who have decided long ago that discomfort is inconvenient. I greeted them softly, smiling, the calm in my voice belying the storm beneath. "Good morning," I said. "Thank you for coming." Melissa smiled faintly, glancing at her watch. "Of course, Mom," she said. "We wanted to check on you." Daniel muttered a distracted greeting, eyes on the table as he set down his coffee cup. There was tension, thin and taut, that neither of them acknowledged. I invited them to sit. They complied, placing themselves strategically close enough to be present, yet far enough to maintain distance. It was a posture I had observed countless times before, not just with them, but in subtle ways in other people who wanted to be polite without truly engaging. I poured tea and offered a small plate of toast. They accepted it mechanically, their attention fractured, scattered between phones, half-heard conversations, and their own thoughts. Then I spoke. "I've been thinking about the house," I said gently, watching them for the first real flicker of attention. "About everything I've done over the years, everything I've given, everything I've tried to build for all of you." Melissa looked up from her phone, eyes narrowing slightly, sensing the gravity in my tone. Daniel's brow furrowed, and for the first time that morning, his attention was fully in the room. "I realized something," I continued. "I've spent decades making your lives comfortable, safe, and predictable. I've rearranged my world, my time, my energy, all for you." I paused, letting the words settle. The room was heavy with unsaid things, the silence amplifying each syllable. They shifted uneasily, as if the weight of my truth was uncomfortable to bear. "And yet," I said softly, "when I am sick, when I need you most, your presence feels optional. A courtesy, not a priority." Melissa's hand trembled slightly as she put down her phone. Daniel cleared his throat, as though he wanted to respond, but couldn't find words adequate to bridge the chasm between us. I let the silence stretch, drawing it out, shaping it into a presence that was almost tactile. I could see their discomfort, their guilt rippling just beneath the surface. They didn't speak because the words they needed to say didn't exist in their vocabulary anymore. "That," I said, leaning forward slightly, my voice calm but unwavering, "hurts more than any illness ever could." Melissa opened her mouth, closed it again. Daniel's jaw tightened. They had been confronted, gently but unmistakably, with the truth they had been avoiding. And that was when it happened. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply let the tension of months, years even, crystallize in a single, simple action. I reached for the envelope on the table, the one holding Thomas's will, and slid it toward them. "This," I said softly, "is everything I have worked for, everything I have built, and everything I've protected for you. And yet, it seems that my presence, my needs, have meant less than I ever imagined." Melissa recoiled slightly, her hand hovering over the envelope. Daniel stared, frozen. I watched the hesitation, the subtle fear in their eyes, the way the weight of decades of neglect finally registered. "I have lived my life ensuring your happiness, often at the expense of my own," I continued. "But it seems that the people I raised, nurtured, and sacrificed for are not capable of prioritizing me when it matters most." I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap. My heart pounded, not with anger, but with the clarity of purpose. "Now," I said, "I will take care of myself in the same way I have taken care of you." Quietly, intentionally, decisively. They didn't understand. Not yet, the subtlety of what I was saying. But they felt it. It was a presence, a weight, a truth they could not ignore. For the first time, I saw their perception of me shift, not as a background character, but as someone whose life, whose choices, whose dignity demanded recognition. Melissa's voice trembled, finally breaking the silence. "Mom, we didn't mean," Daniel cut in more cautiously. "We thought we were helping. We didn't realize." I raised a hand, quieting them. "No," I said, "I don't need apologies. I need acknowledgement. I need presence. I need respect. And if it is not given voluntarily, I will claim it in ways you cannot dismiss." I let the last words hang like a faint echo in the room, small but unrelenting. Then, almost imperceptibly, I reached for my phone and made a series of calls, not loud, not dramatic, but precise. Lawyers, banks, estate managers. I scheduled meetings, clarified intentions, ensured that the resources I had protected all these years would be handled according to my discretion, not theirs. Every move was measured, quiet, unassailable, Melissa and Daniel exchanged panicked glances as they realized that the control they had always assumed over my life, over the house, over my decisions was no longer theirs to wield. Their discomfort deepened, tempered by awe and fear. They understood in that moment that their mother was no longer a passive participant in the story they had thought they controlled. I sipped my tea, calm and composed, while they sat frozen. The air was heavy with the weight of unspoken realizations. The breaking point had arrived not in loud confrontation or a dramatic outburst, but in the undeniable assertion of agency, in the quiet but absolute shift of power. By the time they left, hours later, the house was still and serene once more. The pie I had baked days before was untouched, cooling on the counter, a reminder of my quiet patience and enduring presence. I walked slowly from the kitchen to the living room, feeling the steady strength in my limbs, the clarity in my mind. I had endured months of neglect, subtle betrayals, and emotional distance. And yet, in that quiet morning, I had transformed my suffering into a deliberate, unshakable statement. For the first time, they saw me not just as their mother, but as a woman whose life, whose mind, whose will demanded recognition. And I understood something profound. The true power of a quiet move lies not in spectacle, but in its inevitability. Once set into motion, it cannot be ignored, circumvented, or silenced. The storm had arrived, not with noise, but with presence, not with anger, but with clarity, not with revenge, but with justice, and it would continue deliberately until balance was restored. After that morning, the house settled into an eerie calm, but it was nothing like the silence of weeks before. It was the quiet of anticipation, of tension barely contained, a stillness that hummed with the weight of unspoken consequences. I moved through my days differently now. Every task, every interaction, every decision was deliberate. I was no longer merely reacting to my children's neglect. I was preparing, quietly and meticulously, for a shift they would feel but never see coming. I began with observation. Small details easily overlooked became essential. I noted the rhythm of their lives. Melissa's early mornings filled with back-to-back meetings, Daniel's late-night calls and constant distractions. I noted patterns of inattention, the subtle way they dismissed me without cruelty but without consideration. These patterns were my roadmap, the guideposts of leverage I would employ in silence. Carla, the nurse, became an unwitting ally. Not because I confided in her, but because she moved through the house with quiet diligence, attending to my needs without intrusion. She offered insights inadvertently. Some families, she remarked one day, adjusting my pillows, forget that the people who raised them are still people too. She smiled faintly, busy with her work. I nodded, letting the thought settle. She could never know how close her words brushed the edge of my plan. Financial and legal matters became tools of subtle influence. I reviewed Thomas's estate papers again, tracing every detail with painstaking attention. Investments, property holdings, insurance, everything could be leveraged to ensure my autonomy. But I didn't act hastily. The power of a quiet move lies not in immediacy but in precision. Every step must be considered, deliberate, unassailable. I began to reorganize my daily routines. I scheduled appointments at precise intervals that would intersect with their availability, creating natural opportunities for engagement without confrontation. I made myself indispensable in ways they couldn't ignore, not through force, but through necessity. Even the smallest actions carried weight. I prepared meals that required their presence to fully appreciate, leaving subtle notes of preparation. I sent reminders for family events, positioning myself at the center of the planning without demanding attention. My presence became a quiet gravity, drawing them in not with loud assertion but with careful, deliberate significance. Conversations were now calculated, infused with meaning beneath the surface. I would speak of memories, of traditions, of shared moments, letting nostalgia settle in their hearts without accusation. My words were gentle, almost casual, but they carried weight. I watched their responses carefully, noting where discomfort lingered, where hesitation betrayed recognition of my subtle authority. One afternoon, I decided to host a small gathering, inviting extended family for tea under the guise of casual hospitality. I prepared everything meticulously, yet left key responsibilities for Melissa and Daniel to fulfill. They arrived, eager to participate but unprepared for the subtle orchestration I had set. As they carried plates and served drinks, I observed silently, noting the way they deferred to me without realizing the power dynamic had shifted. Their casual authority over me had eroded quietly, almost imperceptibly, yet unmistakably. At tea night, I reviewed my notes, tracing the patterns of behavior that would serve my larger purpose. I did not act impulsively. Impatience was my enemy. Power, once granted through years of devotion and neglect, is fragile. It must be exercised with care, measured with precision. My strategy unfolded like a chessboard, each move calculated several steps ahead, and beneath it all was a quiet emotional transformation. I no longer felt resentment in the sharp, reactive way that might have destroyed me in earlier months. I felt clarity, control, awareness of my worth, and the inevitability of recognition. I began speaking differently to myself, reinforcing the truth I had discovered. Your presence is not optional, I whispered as I moved through the house. Your life, your decisions, your dignity, they matter. Even small victories reinforced my resolve. A reluctant apology from Melissa for a missed visit, a hesitant acknowledgement from Daniel of my efforts, these became markers of progress, indicators that my quiet influence was taking root. Weeks passed. The house carried a new energy, subtle but undeniable. My children's interactions with me shifted imperceptibly. Their eyes lingered, their voices softened, their words contained an awareness that had been absent. They did not understand the depth of the change, but they felt it. In those weeks, I also honed my own routines, restoring parts of myself that had been dormant for decades. I read books I had long shelved, wrote letters I would never send, and revisited hobbies Thomas and I had enjoyed together. Each act reinforced my independence, ensuring that my quiet strategy was grounded not in manipulation but in the undeniable strength of a life fully lived. I realized then that the silent phase of strategy is not merely about patience. It is about presence, awareness, and subtle assertion of value. It is the careful balancing of necessity and influence, of restraint and initiative. It is not about revenge in the explosive sense. It is about reclaiming the recognition and respect that have been absent for too long, and I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that when the time came to reveal the shift in power, it would be complete. My children would see the consequences of their neglect, not in anger or chaos, but in deliberate, undeniable reality. By the end of that month, the pattern was set. My children were returning my calls, lingering a bit longer when they visited, and I felt the steady pulse of influence beneath every interaction. It was not dramatic, it was not loud, but it was absolute. And in that quiet, deliberate mastery of my own life, I found something I hadn't realized I had been missing: the calm, unshakable knowledge that I had become the author of my own story again. The day of the reveal arrived with no fanfare, no dramatic announcement. It began like any ordinary morning, with sunlight spilling softly across the living room, the familiar hum of the neighborhood drifting through open windows. I had prepared for this moment carefully, subtly, over weeks of observation, planning, and quiet influence. Every small move had been deliberate, every interaction a piece of the foundation I had been building. Melissa arrived first, clutching her laptop bag, her voice clipped but polite. Daniel followed shortly after, his presence careful, hesitant, as if sensing, without knowing why, that the dynamics had shifted. They didn't realize it yet, but the balance of power in our relationship had begun to tip. I greeted them warmly, calm and composed, the smile on my face carefully measured. "Good morning," I said. "I'm glad you're both here," Melissa nodded, adjusting her bag. "Morning, Mom," she replied, her tone neutral. Daniel set down his coffee and cleared his throat. "How are you feeling today?" "Better," I said simply. "Thank you for asking. But I think it's time we talk about some practical matters." Their eyes met, an unspoken tension flickering between them. They had learned gradually, that my calm was not weakness, and my words were no longer empty pleasantries. I walked over to the table and placed an envelope before them, the one I had prepared weeks earlier. "This is everything that Thomas and I have planned for the future," I said, my voice steady, measured. "Our home, our finances, our estate. It has been preserved carefully for you. But I want to make one thing clear. From now on, all decisions about it, about me, about my life, will be made by me. Not by convenience, not by obligation, but by choice." Melissa's hand hovered over the envelope. Her eyes widened, a flicker of realization crossing her face. Daniel stiffened, his jaw tight. "I know this may be uncomfortable," I continued, "but I've spent too many years prioritizing others at the expense of my own needs. That stops now." The air was heavy with silence. They wanted to speak, to interrupt, to reclaim some imagined authority, but they found their words insufficient. The quiet power I had cultivated over weeks was absolute, deliberate, and undeniable. Then I laid out the next part of my plan. Carefully and calmly, adjustments to estate management, healthcare arrangements, and personal autonomy. Each point was precise, well documented, and unassailable. I had ensured that my directives could not be ignored, manipulated, or postponed. Melissa's voice trembled, finally breaking through the tension. "Mom, we didn't realize." "I understand," I said softly, holding her gaze. "But the point is not about realization. It's about respect. And respect is something that must be earned, acknowledged, and upheld, not assumed." Daniel tried to interject, his voice slightly sharper this time. "But we thought we were helping. We didn't know." I held up a hand, silencing him. "Intentions do not substitute for presence. Actions do. And it is actions over time that define respect and care." They were quiet then, the weight of my words settling in, undeniable and persistent. For the first time in years, they were not directing the conversation. They were receiving it. They were on the receiving end of a deliberate, unshakable assertion of my authority over my life, my choices, my dignity. I watched as comprehension dawned in their eyes, the understanding that the mother they had thought would always wait, always forgive, always defer, was no longer a passive participant. I had quietly, deliberately shifted the power dynamic. Melissa's lips pressed together, a mixture of guilt and admiration in her expression. Daniel's eyes softened, the first hint of acknowledgement breaking through his habitual defensiveness. I allowed a moment of pause, letting the impact settle. There was no dramatic flare, no outburst, just the quiet, undeniable truth. I was the arbiter of my life, my health, my home. Then I leaned back, calm and composed, letting them process the gravity of what had just been revealed. I did not gloat. I did not demand apologies. I simply existed in my authority, serene, self-assured, unshakable. They had underestimated the quiet power of presence, of deliberate action, of patience. And now, in that living room bathed in morning light, they understood subtly, completely, irrevocably that the mother they had taken for granted was no longer invisible, no longer silent, no longer optional. By the time they left that afternoon, the energy in the house had shifted permanently. I felt it in the walls, in the air, in the calm that settled over the rooms. This was not revenge as the world understands it. This was power reclaimed, presence restored, dignity asserted. And it was, in every quiet sense, perfect. As I closed the door behind them, I allowed myself a slow, deep breath. I moved through the house, touching objects that held decades of memory, feeling the quiet satisfaction of a plan executed with patience, precision, and poise, and I understood something profoundly liberating. True influence does not require noise or spectacle. It thrives in patience, in observation, in deliberate, calm action. And now, it was mine, completely. The days that followed were marked by a strange, almost imperceptible tension. Melissa and Daniel came to visit, yes, but differently this time. Their presence was heavier with awareness, their movements more deliberate, their words measured. I noticed every subtle shift, the careful way Melissa carried a cup of tea to avoid spilling, the slight hesitation in Daniel's voice before he spoke. They were walking on the edges of my world now, no longer assuming the effortless control they once took for granted. It was not satisfaction that I felt, exactly, nor was it triumph in a boisterous sense. It was quiet affirmation, a steady, grounding knowledge that my existence, my needs, and my decisions could no longer be dismissed. The balance had shifted, and it had happened without yelling, without confrontation, without public drama. The revelation had been subtle, but absolute. Melissa began lingering longer during visits, a soft tension in her posture that revealed both guilt and recognition. She asked about my health with a sincerity I hadn't seen in months, sometimes waiting for my responses before quickly moving on. Daniel, too, adjusted. He asked questions about bills, appointments, and future plans, not to control, but to include me in decisions as an equal. I watched these changes carefully, silently acknowledging the ways in which they tried to make amends, hesitant though they were. The first time Melissa accidentally brushed against my shoulder and caught herself mid-apology, I let it pass without comment. The subtle act of recognition was enough. Daniel's first tentative offer to take me to a doctor's appointment, rather than assuming I could manage alone, went similarly unremarked. These were small victories, almost invisible, yet they carried immense weight. I continued with my routines, maintaining my calm, deliberate presence. I took walks in the neighborhood, returned phone calls when I wished, and maintained a sense of autonomy that neither of them could infringe upon. Every interaction became a dance of measured power, a delicate assertion that my life was mine, yet shared willingly with them on my terms. One evening, Melissa and Daniel both came together, bringing my grandchildren along. I had baked a pie earlier in the day, deliberately leaving it in plain view on the counter. The children ran in, laughter echoing through the house, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to relax. I joined them in the kitchen, guiding their small hands as they helped with slices and toppings. Watching Melissa and Daniel exchange glances I could only describe as awe and a tinge of guilt. No words were needed. They understood what the quiet shift had been about. They had glimpsed a subtle, deliberate strategy that had transformed the dynamic of our household. And in that understanding, they found a tentative respect that had been absent for years. Over the following weeks, the pattern solidified. They checked in more consistently, lingered a little longer, and even brought small gestures of care without prompt. It was not perfection. There were still moments of distraction, moments when the old habits tried to slip back in, but they were minor, almost inconsequential, compared to the overarching shift, and through it all, I felt something I hadn't in months: quiet contentment. Not from vengeance, not from manipulation, but from clarity. I had reclaimed my agency, restored balance, and ensured that my presence could no longer be ignored. The emotional fallout had been subtle but powerful, a testament to patience, deliberate action, and the undeniable force of quiet authority. I sat in my living room one evening, watching the fading light spill across the floor, the house filled with the low hum of conversation, laughter, and movement. I thought of Thomas, of the years we had shared, of the children who had once taken my presence for granted, and I realized something profound. Love and respect cannot be assumed, nor can they be demanded through anger. They are earned through presence, through patience, and through deliberate, unwavering action. I felt the weight of all that had passed, the neglect, the subtle betrayals, the quiet tension, and I let it settle without bitterness. My children had learned slowly and delicately the lesson that presence and care are not conveniences but essential truths. And I, having orchestrated this lesson with care and dignity, felt a deep, enduring satisfaction. For the first time in years, the home felt balanced. My life felt whole, and I understood, more fully than ever, the quiet power of deliberate, patient assertion. I sit now in the living room, the house quiet except for the soft tick of the clock on the mantel. Evening sunlight filters through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floorboards I have walked for decades. I let my hands rest on my lap and breathe in the calm that has settled here, calm earned through patience, observation, and deliberate action. Looking back, I see the months that unfolded not as a series of betrayals, but as lessons. Every slight, every ignored phone call, every subtle dismissal from Melissa and Daniel was a mirror, reflecting truths I had long buried under decades of motherhood, that my presence was powerful, that my care was invaluable, and that respect, when absent, could be reclaimed not through anger, but through quiet, unwavering resolve. I think of Thomas, and how he always spoke of balance in life, of the quiet power of patience. I understand now, more than ever, the depth of his wisdom. Anger is fleeting, resentment corrodes, but action, deliberate and measured, leaves a lasting mark. My strategy was never about vengeance. It was about recognition, teaching my children, without shouting or spectacle, that their mother's life, health, and dignity are not secondary. Melissa has begun to linger more often when she visits, her hands no longer fidgeting, her tone soft but sincere. Daniel, too, has shifted, his presence more thoughtful, his words deliberate, his respect earned rather than assumed. They have not returned to the careless habits of the past, and perhaps they never will, and that is enough. I have learned something about myself in this process, too. I am still a mother, yes, but I am also a woman who deserves consideration, a life of her own making, and the power to influence her world quietly but effectively. I am more than the sum of my sacrifices. I am more than the invisible caretaker they once assumed I would always be. I look around the house, the photographs lining the walls, the furniture imbued with memories, the soft sunlight touching each familiar surface, and I feel an enduring sense of presence. This home, our life, these years of effort and love, they are mine, and through them, I have reclaimed a place that can never again be ignored. As night falls, I sit by the window and watch the street outside. Families walk hand in hand, children chase one another's laughter through the air, neighbors greet each other in quiet routines. Life continues beyond these walls, but I no longer feel peripheral. I am present, I am seen, I am acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement, I have found dignity. Not the fleeting kind, tied to applause or recognition from others, but the steady, unshakable kind that comes from understanding your own worth, asserting it with calm precision, and watching as the world around you adjusts quietly. To honor it, I take a deep breath and let it out slowly. The storm has passed. What remains is the serene certainty that I have reclaimed my life not through anger, not through drama, not through spectacle, but through the quiet, deliberate assertion of presence, care, and unwavering self-respect. And in this calm, I know, finally, that I am whole.